Okay, we are officially live. So what's going on, ladies and gentlemen of the internet? We need to talk about wealth inequality in America. This is a topic of conversation that gets very taboo when it comes to the personal finance space because everybody is so up in arms about wealth inequality and how the 1% own essentially 90% of the wealth in the United States. I am not the type that gets all up in arms about this. I think that, yes, there is such a vast gap between the people who have and the people who don't have, but I'm also somebody who believes that if you actually manage your money right, you can better your financial situation in all facets, including wealth building. So we're going to do a couple of things in this stream. We're going to check out this video from Humphrey Yang talking about wealth inequality. And then there were some great comments that my team found from this video that go into topics like systematic solutions and policy, root causes and economic history, taxes, and more importantly, at the very end of this, I'm going to show you at least some tips that you can use right now, regardless of your financial situation, to better your situation down the road in the future. Yes, I am basically going to be telling you that this is what you can do to do it. But at the end of the day, you got to actually put in the work. So let's check out this video from Humphrey Yang on wealth inequality in America has never been worse, and the middle class has disappeared.
Most people have no clue about how severe wealth inequality has become in America and how much worse it's getting. There's a YouTube video by user Paulette Zane where he references a study done by a Harvard economist and professor, and the study asked 5,000 Americans how they believed wealth was distributed in the United States. The group was first asked what they thought the wealth distribution in America looked like. Dividing up American wealth into 5 segments, the participants came up with the following, a bar chart that looks like this, with the top 20% owning a little bit more than half of the nation's wealth and the bottom 20% owning just a sliver of wealth, no more than 5%. Participants were then asked what they thought the ideal.
And if you ask a lot of people in the United States, or just people in general, what they believe the actual split is within wealth, like when it comes to wealth, you probably get numbers like this, where people think the vast majority of the wealth is by this segment over here. And then the segment on the left, those are in the bottom 20%, have very little. We all believe that. We all know it's true. But when you see it, it's going to be way worse than what we have thought
Distribution should be. Over 9 out of 10 participants said it should look something like this, slightly more equally distributed, but the top 20%.
And believe it or not, this right here, this is actually realistic. You could get to a place, not necessarily where the top 20% has this little bit, but where like the bottom 20% and the bottom 60% overall actually has more than what they do now. And that just comes from money management, which we will talk about later on in this stream. But as someone who grew up broke and grew up on Section 8, food stamps, and all of that, I know that this can be a reality.
Of course, still own quite a bit of the nation's wealth. Before I show you what the actual distribution looks like, many of you might actually point out that, hey, this YouTube video was done like a decade or 12 years ago. Surely the answers could have changed since then. But the reality is that human behavior and thought process seldomly changes that quickly. Answers have stayed pretty consistent even though time has passed. In fact, in 2020, CBS did a morning show where they asked random mall shoppers what they thought wealth distribution in America looked like with pumpkin pie. The pie was to represent total American household wealth, and it was cut into 10 slices. The subjects were then asked to distribute those 10 slices into the same 5 segments. The usual distribution they chose looked like something in this picture.
So I saw this, and this is probably the most unrealistic depiction of wealth distribution that I've probably ever seen, because this suggests that most of the wealth in America is in the middle class. And as we've seen in current days, even back probably when this video was actually made, that has never been the case. It has always been that, yes, a majority of the wealth is in the upper middle class and wealthy segments of here. And unfortunately, with the current years, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to a lot of policies within our government, the middle class has just been shrinking to the point that it's barely existing.
This person allocated most of the pie to the middle class. In fact, all of the subjects during that segment displayed similar results to that of the original study done by the original video. That goes to show you that there's still a huge misconception about how wealth is actually distributed within the United States among its own citizens. Okay, so the actual distribution looks like this. The top 20% of Americans own over 80% of the nation's.
This is supposedly how it is in real life. This is kind of ridiculous, even for me who believes in capitalism, for me someone who believes in free markets. The fact that the top 20% own pretty much 80% of the wealth, and it's actually a fact, is insane. But it's also just like, it hurts to see like the bottom 20 and the second 20, just how little they own. And to me, it's like, it's a double-edged sword. It's like part of it is because of things like policy and lack of education when it comes to personal finances, things like that. But it also has a layer of choice in it. Like if you ask somebody in the bottom 20 or the second 20, if they had X amount of money extra, like what would they do with it? Unfortunately, they would probably say that they would invest it and start a business and all that. But with human behavior, we kind of seen it with like stimulus checks where we would get them. A lot of times it got spent on nonsense, if I'm being honest. I've seen people in Harlem where I grew up spending it on shoes, clothes, accessories, electronics, when they were supposed to use it on necessities like food, paying their rent, because at the time of the pandemic, we all weren't working. And unfortunately, that's the reality when it comes to like the bottom 40%. There's a good percentage of us that are trying to just survive and just pay our bills. But then there are some within that range that have a little bit of discretionary income, but just choose to spend it on nonsense.
Total wealth. The bottom 20% and the next 20%, so the 21st to 40th percentile, barely even register on this bar chart, and the middle class makes up less than 5 to 6% of the overall bar. This should be startling to you, and what's even more crazy is how much the top 1% actually has in terms of wealth. The top 1% has more wealth than what most Americans think the top 20% should have. But still, that doesn't really put the top 1% into its full context, which the original video from 2012 did really well. In that video, the original creator took all 340 million Americans and reduced them down to a representative 100 people. He then ordered them from left to right, poorest on the left, richest on the right, and put them on a scale with each 10% representing a different percentile of wealth. Taking total household wealth in America and reducing it down to a pile of symbolic cash, he then spread it out among the 100 representative Americans. This is what Americans want the wealth distribution to look like. This looks pretty healthy. The poverty line is way over here on the left, and even though people are poor, they aren't in quote poverty. The middle class has the bulk of the wealth here, and the wealthy own just slightly more than the middle class. There's a smooth transition of wealth across the board here, but we all know that it's a lot worse than this. This is the distribution of how Americans think wealth is spread out in the United States. About 5% of the poor are now living in poverty. The wealthy definitely have a lot more than the middle class here, making about 10 times more than them, and up to 100 times more than the poorest Americans. If you were to ask most people if this is acceptable, they'd probably say no. However, this still isn't the reality of how it's actually distributed. So here's what reality looks like on that same scale. The poverty line is now moved up to 11.6% with 37.9 million people living in poverty. The census defines that as making less than $12,760 per year, or about
Y'all, that is about a little over $1,000 a month.
$35 per day for a single person under the age of 65. The middle class here is very hard to differentiate from the poor, and the richest people have so much wealth that it's hard to even comprehend. They don't even fit on the screen. But what's even
but let's go back to this real quick. So, and this is something that's eye-opening for me because I am in the middle class right now in terms of like the standard middle class level for the United States. Definitely not that considering the fact that I'm in New York, but my income is like somewhere along the lines of this 40 to 60% range. And you feel just how little that money actually is. Like I remember being in the 10% range and thinking if I could only make it up to like this middle level, this middle class lifestyle, I would be set. The unfortunate reality is so many things have happened over the last like 10, 20 years that pretty much shifted wealth all the way to this side and made it to where if you were making this kind of income in the middle class area, you basically were just getting by. Unfortunately,
it's hard to even comprehend. They don't even fit on the screen. But what's even harder to comprehend is just how much more money the top 1% holds in wealth compared to the rest of the nation. And what I want to accomplish in this video is show you how big that disparity is and how much it's actually changed since 11 years ago. According to recent Federal Reserve data, the top 1% of all Americans own a whopping 31% of the nation's wealth. That's $43.94 trillion of the nation.
So never mind that. Look at the fact that the top 10% overall own about 69% of the wealth. That's actually a lot better than what most people assume. Most people assume like the top 10% own like 90% of the wealth, but 69% is still ridiculously high.
$140 trillion in wealth. The top 1% is defined as those having a net worth of over $11.1 million, and because they are so wealthy, the scale of them might be pretty hard to comprehend. In fact, we had to make a separate column just for them. If we expand our parameters slightly, the top 10% own 69% of the wealth of the entire nation, while the remaining 90% of people own just 31% or a third of the nation's wealth. What that means is that the majority of wealth, close to 70%, is concentrated in the hands of few. What's even crazier is that the bottom 50% owns just $3.44 trillion of wealth. That means the entire bottom half of the population in the United States owns just a mere 2.45% of the entire nation's wealth. The crazier part though is that even though you think that's bad, that's actually an improvement since 2012 where the bottom 50% just owned 0.87% of the nation's wealth. That means the bottom half of the population has nearly doubled their total household wealth since 2012, but that doesn't really matter because the top 1% also grew their wealth considerably. It's important to understand how wealth inequality has changed because that gap has certainly widened over the years. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they conducted a 2018 study on wealth inequality across 28 industrialized countries, and one of their primary findings was the following. Quote, out of the 5 countries for which several observations are available, wealth inequality increased in the US and the UK since the Great Recession in 2008. These changes are associated with falling home prices, lower rates of home ownership, but higher prices of financial assets in the recovery benefiting the top of the distribution. With that being said, let's take a look at wealth distribution within the United States from 1989 to 2012 all the way to 2023. In 1989, the distribution in the United States looked closer to this. The top 1% owned 22% of the nation's wealth, still quite a lot, but nowhere near what they own today. The top 10% in its entirety owned 60% of the nation's wealth, and the remaining 90% owned 40%. The bottom 50%, they only own 3.79% of the wealth. In 2012, when that video was published, the distribution looked like the following. The top 10% owned 67.96%, or 68% of the nation's wealth, rounding up, and the remaining 90% now own 32% of the wealth. So in about a quarter of a century, the wealthiest 10%, they started to own 8% more wealth, while the bottom 90% owned 8% less wealth. We can see that the gap clearly started to widen around that time, but now here's what that looks like in 2023. The top 10% now owns 69% of the nation's total wealth, with the remaining owning 31%. That means in just a decade, the gap has widened even more, with 1% more wealth going towards the top 10% and 1% less for the remainder.
Let's talk about a big reason why. And I'm going to go back to the pandemic for this one. During the pandemic, when we got our stimulus checks for it, our pandemic stimulus checks, like I said, some people put it into savings. Some people use it for their necessities like their groceries and all of that. But a lot of people use it to spend money on ridiculous junk, which means that this money, which was essentially printed, like, you know, fake money, printed, cut a check for everybody, that then went to the richest people. That's why if you ask a bunch of millionaires and billionaires what would happen if you took every single person in the United States and just split all the wealth so everybody had an equal amount, a lot of them would tell you that within 10 years, all of it would funnel right back to the people at the top. Why? Because the people at the top have certain business histories, they have contacts, they have resources that they've accumulated pretty much their entire professional careers, to where they know how to build a business to provide products and services that people are willing to spend money on. And the people that don't have all of these or any of these skill sets or any of these contacts or any of these resources will just consume the products and services that were given by the people who have built them, thus funneling that money from those who can't do it to those who can. Unfortunately, that is the reality of it, and that pretty much has caused this economic inequality to just spread wildly, especially ever since 2020.
Let's look at the top 10% wealth and just look at how it's changed from 1989 to 2012 to 2023. 22.67% of the wealth in 1989 went to the top 10%. That number changed to 29.13% in 2012, and now 31.26% of the nation's wealth is concentrated among the top 1%. Now, I'm no statistician here, but this trend is clearly disheartening. One thing I was wondering was, how do other countries fare? Are they seeing the same trends that we are seeing, or are they seeing their wealth gap, decreasing? Well, that same study from 2018 looked at 28 other countries like Denmark, Germany, Canada, Japan, and Italy, and it found that the wealth disparity in the United States is unrivaled by any other industrialized country. On average, across all of these global countries, the top 10% would own 52% of their respective nation's wealth. This is considerably different from what we experience here in the United States, so much so that the United States is a crazy outlier among other countries. Looking at this graph, the most offending countries in terms of wealth inequality would be the Netherlands and Denmark after the United States, but you can still see that United States here is a clear outlier. One of the biggest reasons I think the United States has such a wealth disparity between the top 1% and the rest of the population is due to the fact that in the US we have the sheer most amount of billionaires that live here. According to Forbes, the United States has the highest number of Forbes is due to the fact that in the US
but also, not only the fact that we have pretty much the highest number of billionaires, look at the actual billionaires and what they own. You have Berkshire Hathaway with Warren Buffett. He is hands down one of the greatest investors in the world. Great. Larry Ellison from Oracle, Bill Gates from Microsoft, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Elon Musk, Tesla. Just with these people alone, they pretty much own parts of some of the companies and brands that you and I use on a day-to-day basis, whether it is Tesla's, whether it is Amazon, Whole Foods, Prime Video, Microsoft products, Xbox for all the gamers, PC gaming, pretty much all run through Microsoft through Windows. Heck, my computer runs off of Windows. Like, these people have billions of dollars because they've created products and services that pretty much change generations, that pretty much set up generations, that pretty much got us to a point that we rely on them on a day-to-day basis. That's why they were able to accumulate so much money.
We have the sheer most amount of billionaires that live here. According to Forbes, the United States has the highest number of billionaires with 735 publicly listed billionaires, followed by China with 698 billionaires and India with 237. Germany and Russia complete the top 5. Ranking website Snopes, 735 billionaires in the United States collectively held over $4.5 trillion of wealth at the end of 2022. That's more than the entire bottom 50% of all American households. Let that sink in. This type of wealth is incomprehensible to the human mind. In fact, if we just took the average net worth of all of these billionaires, so you just took the sum of their total wealth divided by 735, each billionaire on average would own about $6.1 billion in net worth. That's 110,000 times the amount of a family in the bottom 50%'s net worth, and 555 times that of someone who just broke into the top 1% with a net worth of $11.1 million. That's right, your average billionaire is 555 times more richer than someone who just hit the top 1%. And those top 1%ers were already 200 times richer than those in the bottom 50%. Billionaire wealth has always been a controversial topic. In fact, I made a video back in 2020 about Jeff Bezos' wealth in rice, and usually the attention does go towards these individuals like Jeff Bezos or even Elon Musk. Let's actually take a look at Elon Musk's total net worth of $248 billion, and let's try to put it into perspective. The New York Times did a fascinating article about a year ago on Jeff Bezos' wealth. They did a bunch of cool visualizations, but this was back when Jeff Bezos was the #1 richest guy in the world. But since Elon now holds that title, let's actually do the same visualizations just in Elon Elon terms, shall we? This right here is a Toblerone chocolate. The height of one of these is about 1.05 inches tall. Let's pretend for a moment that the height of this Toblerone chocolate represents the median wealth of a household in the United States, or about $121,700. We can then start stacking Toblerones one on top of each other, just like so. So that means this stack of 3 would represent about $365,000 of total wealth. And if we kept stacking these Toblerones all the way up and up and up and up, how tall do you think we would have to stack these Toblerones to get to Elon Musk's wealth? Well, let me tell you, Elon Musk's net worth would stretch upwards all the way to the height of Mount Everest. Yeah, that's right, Mount Everest, 29,000 feet, but not just one Mount Everest, maybe 2 Mount Everests, you might say. Nope, not even 2 Mount Everests. The answer is 7 Mount Everests tall. You'd have to climb Everest 7 times to get the equivalent net worth of Elon Musk, where the median net worth was the height of this piece of chocolate. Fascinating. This is an Oreo. It measures about 1.7 inches in diameter. It also represents the median net worth of someone in America at $121,700. You probably know where I'm going with this, but 3 of these cookies across would be 5.25 inches, which is a pretty good size, but it's also worth about $165,000 in net worth in our example. So if each of these cookies represents the median wealth
Did you just make a dirty joke?
of an American at 1.75 inches, or $121,700 in median net worth for the American household, how many of these would need to be laid side by side to get to Elon Musk's net worth? Well, you need about 2,333,607 of these cookies laid side by side. To put that into perspective, we would need to go super wide. In fact, as wide as the Grand Canyon, not just once, not just twice, but 3 separate times. 3 separate times. That is very fascinating. And you know what? Wealth, here we go. Lastly, here's my favorite depiction of Elon Musk's wealth.
Okay, it seems like he's just going in on Elon's wealth, so we're just gonna leave this video. But one of the things that my team, my channel manager specifically, really pointed out is some of the commonalities that you see when you go through the comments of this video. So much so that we actually came up with some topics based on some of the more popular comments in this video. So we're gonna go through this list and we're gonna just come up with why wealth inequality got so bad, or how it got so bad, and what can the average person actually do to better their own financial situation and get out of whichever level they're currently at, whether you're bottom 20, next 20, middle class, just to be sure you have a little breathing room, especially with the way that the economy is going today. So first thing was about systematic solution and policies. So there was 2 comments that stood out to my channel manager regarding this. And the first one was about the solution I've always imagined is having companies have more employee-owned stocks. So with a lot of startup companies, when they go to attract talent, they tend to offer stock as a part of their compensation package. So they'd be like, oh, we will give you, you know, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year plus X amount of money in stock. Especially if you actually go to some of the bigger publicly traded companies like your Amazons, your Facebooks, your Googles. They really do provide a lot of stock options in terms of RSUs for their employees as part of their compensation plan. However, that is not the easiest thing to do when you've realized that only 1% of companies are actually publicly traded. So, look, I'm going to actually Google this. What percentage of companies are publicly traded? So if I go right over here, bring it back to the screen. According to Google, a vast majority of companies are actually private, with less than 1% of U.S. businesses being publicly traded. For U.S. companies with revenues of over 100 million, approximately 87% are privately held. So if a vast majority of companies are privately owned, they don't have stock options that they can just give to their employees in order to keep them, or in order to further compensate them for the work that they're doing. Wait, will they'll tap in got you for life? You know what? I appreciate all the messages, but I don't know what is going on in my Kick chat right now. But that is the problem there. And then this one really got my attention where it says return to the 1960s tax policies would be a great first step. And then a bunch of people asking, how does this even happen when it comes to wealth inequality? So I took all of this and I went to ChatGPT and I just asked it a simple question. I said, hey, ChatGPT, I have a question regarding wealth inequality in the United States. What's your best hypothesis for how wealth inequality has gotten as bad as it has? So it said, it actually gave us quite a bit of information as to what could have led to our current state of wealth inequality in the country. So first one being the structural layer, policies, taxes, and deregulation. So starting in the 1970s and early 80s, the US began shifting towards what economists called neoliberal economics, emphasizing deregulation, privatizations, tax cuts, especially for corporations and top earners. Now, in my very little time of caring about politics, what I tend to notice is that uh, governments, politicians, they will do this for one of two reasons. One, in the very minor but very true facet, they are getting some kind of back end deals for having for pushing some policies like this. But also, policies like this tend to get pushed whenever you need to stimulate an economy. So let's say now we're possibly going through a recession. So more legislation similar to this would probably go out there to convince more people to start businesses, take out loans, spend money, because all of that drives the economy forward. And you want to make sure that you're keeping that flow going. So going through this list, you had tax policy. Top marginal tax rates were dropped from 70% in the 1970s to around 37% today. Now, let's think about that. For every $100 that for every $100 back in the 1970s that you made in this like top tax bracket, you were getting charged 70% of it. Nobody wants to pay 70% of their money. People in certain parts of Europe do it, but that's because they get certain public benefits for it, like free healthcare, free education. Some love it. Some people say they hate it and wish that all of that was privatized. Unfortunately, I have no knowledge about European like policy and taxation, so I can't even help you with that part. But I can tell you as a US citizen, as someone who makes a middle class income, I would hate it if I was paying 70% top tax rate. But the fact that it got dropped to 37% today, which in my opinion is still even too high. Capital gains, where the wealthy make most of their money, are taxed at a lower rate than wages. So the rich literally earn more money for being rich. I know I went on a little rant, but let's go through all of that. So people who are in the highest tax brackets, let me see, what's the highest tax bracket right now in the United States? Highest tax bracket, US. So 37%, that is basically somebody who's single that makes $626,000 or a married couple that makes $751,000. Okay, so keep these numbers in mind. That means if you are in those tax brackets in the 1970s, you were getting taxed 70% at the top rate. Not meaning that 70% of your total income is being taken. No, it's a progressive tax system. But basically, once you hit the top level, you were getting taxed 70%. That got lowered to 37%. That means top earners, people who made that kind of income, they were saving more money because they weren't getting taxed at nearly as much. And then the whole thing with capital gains is why I really wanted to make this video. Because there's a lot of people who believe that you need to be rich in order to take advantage of capital gains. That is just not true at all. You can take advantage of capital gains so long as you put your money to any kind of investments in terms of like stocks. which we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to get through the rest of this. Financial deregulation, the loosening rules on Wall Street, culminating in the repeal of the Glass-Steagall in 1999, created massive financialization, meaning more wealth built from money manipulation, not productive work. Okay, weakened unions. Union membership plummeted from over 30% in 1950 to about 10% today. That meant lower wage bargaining power for workers. Some people understand that unions are good, but don't necessarily understand the full power of a union. I feel like the people who understand fully how powerful a union can be are those of us who are either blue-collar workers who are unionized, or those who watch a lot of sports, which is where I fall. I sit in and I watch how the players' unions for the NFL, the NBA, the MLB, how much they go to bat for the players when it's time to renegotiate collective bargaining agreements. Those things can take forever, but it's meant to get the players to get paid as much as possible and to make sure revenue sharing and things like that are about as fair as possible. So you don't understand, if you've never been part of a union, just how powerful that is, especially when it comes time for like negotiations and stuff like that. Oh my gosh, now my Twitch chat is like having a bunch of people, like bots and stuff. But let's get to the second reason. The economic layer, wage stagnation and capital explosion. This is one where a lot of people tend to get really, really emotionally triggered. Since the 1980s, worker productivity has soared, but wages have barely moved in real terms. That is very true. The fact that we are in the United States, and I think what's the income for like the minimum wage in the U.S.? That's from MetLife. Minimum wage, United States. The minimum wage in the United States is still $7.25 an hour. Now, minimum wage does vary depending on where you're at. I think here in New York right now it's about 17 an hour. The goal is to get it to like 20 an hour, and then if we get Mamdani as mayor, he's trying to push for 30 an hour. I don't know if that's going to work, but like minimum wage in the United States has pretty much barely moved. Meanwhile, productivity for companies have rapidly expanded, especially as technology developed, as we had the computer, as we had the internet. Now we have AI, which can basically do a lot of the work for you, especially in things like research. Hence me using ChatGPT for research in this video. Meanwhile, capital ownership became concentrated. The wealthy own most of the assets, stock, real estate, businesses, and those assets appreciated in rates far exceeding wage growth. So while the middle class earned paychecks, upper class earned equity. I want to focus on this: stocks, real estate, and businesses. Now, when you hear about these things and how the wealthy own a lot of them, blah, 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 yes, it is true. However, that does not mean that the average person cannot have these things. I have people on my Instagram who grew up in similar situations as me, people who I've met either in high school, college, who actually own businesses. I have a couple of friends from high school that have a really successful frozen drink business, and that pretty much turned into a bunch of other ventures for them because they eventually pivoted into real estate. I have someone on my Instagram that is a landlord. He does own a few properties that he rents out. Pretty much bought one and then used the money from that one to buy the second, so on and so forth. But I feel like for someone who's at the very beginning stages, owning stocks, especially in 2025, is easier than ever. Like, you don't need a 401k. You don't need like an account from your job or to go to a banker or none of that. You simply just need to download an app on your phone. Ideally, an app that will let you buy fractional shares. So I personally recommend M1 because that's how I started. And you simply just start putting a little bit of money in there. and let it work for you. If you can only put $10, $20 a month into it, that's better than putting $0. And that just gets you into the habit of starting to invest. So while yes, the vast majority of assets are being owned by big corporations, billionaires, it doesn't mean that all hope is lost for the average person. It just really means that the average person needs to start now, build the habit, and then just expand it down the road. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The social layer: education, geography, and technology. So education costs skyrocketed while wage premiums for college degrees grew, locking many people into debt cycles instead of upward mobility. This, yes, I feel like nowadays we're noticing that like the college degree is not worth nearly as much as what people thought it was going to be. Especially if you're not going into like the career specific degrees. Like if you're not going into accounting, if you're not going into law, into medical, careers that absolutely require a college degree, you're pretty much wasting your time and more importantly, wasting your money and going into debt. I know people in my industry in leasing who went to college, got a 4-year degree, are paying student loans back up the wazoo, and here I am in the same position as them, and I only have a high school diploma. Why? Because that industry, you don't need a college degree at all. You simply just need to get your license, which is ridiculously easy to get a real estate license, and have the skill set, the gift of gab to talk to people, to be social. If you know how to be social with people, sales is probably the best career you could go into without needing any kind of degree. Thus, you don't have to worry about the education cost and all of that BS that comes with it. Geographic inequality intensified, I can't even talk today, as high-paying industries clustered in major metros, leaving smaller cities hollowed out. You see this a lot with like the Amazons and the Metas of the world, the Teslas of the world. Where are their main offices primarily located? California, Texas, New York, Florida. So, and I'm talking about like the major metropolitan areas of there. Silicon Valley, New York City, Miami, Florida, Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas. These companies are moving a vast majority of their higher income positions into those major metropolitan areas, which is what they're talking about, thus leaving like the suburban and the rural areas out in the cold. Tech and automation created a winner-take-all economy where few companies and founders capture enormous value with relatively few employees. This you could do pretty much anywhere. Like I know content creators that, not that I know them personally, but I have seen them on YouTube. They do their entire content production with just them and ChatGPT. Hey, Ami, I checked your videos. Seems you're a new and Kick, not yet affiliated. I got a proposal about sharing your stream. No, I'm good. Thank you so much, Vine Media, but I'm okay. But yeah, like a lot of content creators now, especially the faceless channels, it's just them and AI services. They have a service for their thumbnails, they have a service for their video creation, their script writing, voiceover work, and they will crank out tons of videos just from that. So it's getting ridiculous, but this part right here with tech and automation, that is not something that is exclusively to rich people, poor people, whatever. That is accessible to anyone. ChatGPT's premium service is like $20 a month. The psychological layer: financialization of culture. The US also developed a cultural obsession with individualism and the myth of mediocrity. People are taught to see success or failure as purely personal. If you work hard, you'll make it, which masks structural barriers and reduce pressure for systematic reform. Combine that with consumerism, and you get people chasing lifestyle inflation instead of asset ownership. Many middle-class households became asset poor but debt rich thanks to credit cards, student loans, rising housing costs. Yes, this is facts. Now, I'm not for the masking structural barriers thing. I don't think that's really what's going on. But we are taught to see success as purely personal. And we do believe in consumerism a lot. Like, here's the thing. Growing up, what did we all envision being rich was? It was the cars, the houses, the boats, having a Ferrari, traveling to the south of France or to Greece for vacation. Where do you summer? Where do you winter? But no one taught you that to be rich really meant to own assets, not to have flashy cars, homes, and all of that. Thus, we grew up with the wrong sense of actually being rich, of actually building wealth. And because we grew up with the wrong sense of that, we focus so much on looking rich. That's why you see people in Miami renting out Ferraris and freaking Lamborghinis every time, instead of actually owning companies, owning parts of companies, owning stocks, shares, real estate. It's not the sexy thing, so nobody really does it. Rebounded. Okay, last one. Compounding crisis of the 2008 financial crisis. So the Great Recession was a turning point. The wealthy recovered quickly because they owned the assets that rebounded, stocks and real estate. The middle and lower class didn't. They lost homes, savings, job stability. The recovery basically supercharged the wealth gap that was already decades in the making. And this goes to what I was talking about earlier when it came to the 2020 pandemic. Things like the pandemic, the 2008 financial crisis, they are known as like turning points when it comes to personal finance and wealth building, because it changes the facet of like who gets rich. Like people, how do I say this properly? Like I'm trying to think about what my uncle taught me like right before or right after the pandemic. One of the things he taught me was that moments like these are what changes people's financial lives forever, whether it's really good or really bad. The only difference between the two is whether or not you own assets. And I'm not talking about needing to own tons of properties or needing to own a big percentage of a company. No, I'm talking about even owning just fractional shares of a company does wonders for your personal finance, for your financial life, for your wealth building journey, because those pivot points, you get to ride that wave as well. I don't know why people seem to think that you need to own a lot already before you can be seen as successful. Whew, that was a lot. But let me see. What else was I gonna tell y'all? Oh, this. This is basically the gist of what I'm saying in this whole stream. Is the fact that if you want to build wealth, if you care so much about wealth inequality and you want to better your own situation, you need to learn this quadrant here. Now, a lot of people who've probably read Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, you're probably watching this and you're making yourself sick because you're thinking of all the times Robert Kiyosaki told you need to pay for X, Y, and Z course. This is not what this is about. I'm not going to tell you to go drop hundreds or thousands of dollars on a BS course. But what I am telling you is that we need to change our brains and get out of this method right here of being employees, self-employed, trading our own time for money, and learn how to slowly build yourself on the right side of becoming a business owner or an investor. Why? Because you're leveraging things on that side of the quadrant that you don't have. What do I mean by that? When you're an employee or you're self-employed, when you're an employee or you're self-employed, you are simply trading your time for money, which is fine and dandy, especially if you're self-employed because you can dictate how much you charge. Here's the problem. We all have the same 24 hours in a day. 8 of those hours, at most, we need to sleep. 8 of those hours we spend working, and 8 of those hours are spent up in the air. Don't know if you're working extra to make more money. Don't know if you're using it to spend time with your family, your friends, your personal life. But All is to say, we only have 24 hours and we are one person each. So why do we need to go to the right side? Because the right side of this quadrant takes advantage of things that you don't have as a singular person. Think about being a business owner. What are you leveraging there? You're leveraging other people's time. You're leveraging like the 24 hours, or I should say the 8 hours of working time for the people that you hired. Think about it. Think about small businesses, because I love talking about small businesses. Think about if you owned an ice cream shop. I used to work in one, shout out Sweet Shop in the Upper East Side. Love them to death. But they would have one of the owners, either the father or the son, and 2 employees. Yes, they were working in their business because they loved what they did, but also they were leveraging 8 hours of work from 2 people. That means they were getting 16 hours of additional work, 16 hours of productivity than what they could have did by themselves. If you included the fact that they also worked in the business, they were getting 24 hours worth of work in an 8-hour time span. That is 3 times more than what they could have did on their own. So yes, you want to be a business owner if that's the route you want to take, because you get to leverage the time of other people. But if you're like me, I don't necessarily like the idea of owning businesses as much, at least not in this stage of my life, because I'm still like in the beginning stages of my journey. My focus is on the investor side. Why? Because you get to leverage the one thing that has the how do I say this? You get to leverage the one thing that does 24 hours worth of work, and that is money. Like, we have 24 hours in the day, so does money. The difference is we cannot work 24 hours straight, or at least we can't do it consistently for a long period of time, because that is just not healthy for us. Money can do it. Money can constantly circulate all day, every day, no issues at all. So if I was starting over all over again, mind you, I'm middle class. I am not, upper class. I'm not wealthy, rich, 1%. No, I'm in the middle class right now, but I built myself to this level from someone who is in basically at or below the poverty line based on the last video we saw. What I'm telling you is, if you want to start that journey, start taking advantage of this side of the quadrant. Take your money from the left side, either from your job, maybe you have a little side hustle, and start putting some of that into investments. Buy some stock, buy some, I don't know, index funds. Just get shares of something and then let it work for you. Oops, I changed it. And let it work for you. Why? Because with time, it just keeps going. I'll give you the perfect example of this. I have a 15-year-old cousin. Her name's Samantha. For Samantha's graduation from middle school, what we all did was that we chipped in and got her first custodial account for stock investing. And it had about $4,000 in there. It's only been a year and some change, and that investment is already up 11%. And she's 15. So in the next 3 years, if it does continue to go up 10%, what is that? From 4,000 to 44. Matter of fact, let's just do the math right now while we're here. Oh, let me move this up. $4,000. It went up 10%. 1.1. So right now it's sitting at about 4,400. She's 15. So in 3 years, that thing will grow 1, 2, 3. If it stays at 10% increase, it'll grow to $5,800 by the time she hits 18. Now, I've had this talk with her. She knows, because she's a very smart girl. She's not touching that money at all. And we just gonna let that thing grow, no matter what. And hopefully, as she grows up, it starts building. And hopefully when she starts working in her career, she just starts adding into it and letting it grow further. Why? Because when money works 24 hours, you are taking advantage of the #1 asset you have throughout your lifetime, and that is time. And time is the thing that will really get you out of this. But I'm going to jump off of this live. I am going to spend the rest of my evening just hanging out in the house. I love y'all.